So we're going to use these aggregate supply and aggregate demand curves that we've just been learning about to talk about kind of recent economic history. And now I know nobody wants to think back to the bad times of 2020, but that was kind of the big deal. Over the last few years, the biggest economic news was the pandemic, the lockdown, fears about things beyond our control. One of the early impacts of lockdown was a dramatic decrease in aggregate demand. People were stuck at home, had fewer things to spend money on. Also, people got worried about what might be coming next, and they stopped or delayed at least a lot of purchases, which in turn meant that a lot of people lost their jobs and spent less money. There's variation in different geographies. Some places locked down more than others. New York was pretty strict. Other states, there was less. But that didn't actually matter that much. People were scared and they cut back their spending. Now there's some degree of circularity here, which is an important feature of macroeconomics. Since people were worried they might lose their job, therefore they cut back their spending. As a lot of people cut back spending, therefore a lot of people lost their jobs. These are kind of self-fulfilling expectations or spirals. That happens going up and going down. They're these spirals of causation. Now, also in the pandemic, there was a lowering of aggregate supply, too. Lockdowns meant that some people were not allowed to go to work. So supply chains got complicated. Some factories shut down for some amount of time, maybe by choice, or maybe they didn't have the parts to make the product because some other factory had decided to shut down. So that had effects throughout the whole economy. If one supplier reduced output, didn't make as much, then everyone who was using their products as inputs couldn't get those, and they had their own difficulties, and they in turn would shut down. So with both aggregate supply and aggregate demand falling, GDP fell a lot. It was the quickest decline in GDP we've ever seen in the US. We had a very sharp recession. Now, fortunately, it was also very short because the government stepped in and made some tremendous efforts to give people money. That allowed them to spend more, and that increased aggregate demand. It pushed aggregate demand significantly outward. Aggregate supply was still complicated. Businesses still faced supply chain issues. Also, as the economy started recovering, Russia invaded Ukraine, and that led to significant change in the price of energy, oil and natural gas, both. That was felt harder in Europe since it was closer, but that had knock-on effects throughout the whole world. And so potential GDP did not increase nearly so much. Now, with aggregate demand rising significantly while aggregate supply was not as much or maybe getting steeper, we saw GDP recover. We're back to record low rates of unemployment. GDP is way up, but also had a lot of inflation. Tremendous increases in the price level. Inflation rates that the U.S. had not seen at any point in decades. We went from the problem of GDP being too low and unemployment really high, and then quickly transitioned to the other problem. GDP doing pretty well, but inflation now too high. Therefore, the Federal Reserve raised interest rates, which lowered aggregate demand and cooled off inflation. Now, they don't want to lower aggregate demand too far. That might cause another recession. The Fed has been aiming for a soft landing and cut interest rates to start to get back towards normal kind of levels. Inflation has been cooling off, unemployment has not risen much, and then with the election, economic uncertainty has predominated. Most businesses just don't know what's going to happen with tariffs or government agencies, and they've just paused new hiring or new investments. So we will see. This data from Fred shows the rate of inflation smoothed over 3 months to show from 2019, when the graph begins, inflation was around 2%. Then things got crazy in 2020. Inflation actually negative in the worst of troubles. Then it increased into the middle of 2022. Like I said, hitting some record highs since it's been 40 or 50 years. Since then, it's come back down, although with the wiggles to show the degree to which figuring out the movements is really pretty difficult. And now finally a graph of GDP growth, this time over a longer period from 1955 to the present. Now what should stand out to you most is absolutely bonkers change in 2020. First, the very sharpest decrease in GDP ever recorded in the second quarter of 2020, followed by the largest increase ever in the third quarter of 2020. Since then, it's gotten back to a little bit closer to normal, but we will see what the future brings.